guys, subscribe WorldWideChels.
I WorldWideChels.
WorldWideChels.
Subscribe to WorldWideChels.
Thank you for your support.
Hello guys, and welcome to another stream on the WorldWideChels channel. It's your host Matt back again, and we are joined by a wonderful panel and a beautiful special guest. It's Ben Jacobs himself. Ben, how are you, my friend?
Even better for being called beautiful in an introduction. I will take that in many ways. How are you guys?
We're all good, and we are joined, of course, by Sadiq, the main man himself. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, man. Thanks for having me on my own channel as well. And nice to meet Ben. And Carlita, as always, man. Good to see you.
And Carlita, of course.
Well, I mean, the most beautiful thing about Ben, besides his words, is his beard, because it is lush. Hey, Ben. Ben is a wonderful journalist with CBS Golazo. And, you know, if journalism were a competition in the summer transfer market, I do feel as though Ben has won the journalistic arms race this last summer. He's really made a name for himself, you know, with the way he's reported and just the way he's carried himself. I thought that he's been admirable, and he set a really great example for how to handle transfers and how to handle news and how to disseminate information to fans that really want to know, because, you know, the comings and goings of players are very important. So, Ben, thank you so much for doing it the right way.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I think the first thing to say on reporting is that we're in a digital age, and most people perhaps view their news through social media now, or if it isn't social media, it's still a notification that then takes you through to a website, and everyone wants the immediacy, and context is underrated. Really, what I try and do is leave my audience anyway, and our audience at CBS as well, with a better understanding of not only the story, which can change. A transfer window is unbelievably unreliable in itself. So,
Yeah.
news day on day or second on second, then you have to brace yourself for changes, because that can happen. It's very unexpected. But what I think fans don't always understand is the intricacy and finesse behind it. And that's what I try and present as well. So you get a better understanding of the process. So then when you do get an unexpected twist, you understand why, because there's that insight and context as to what's actually happened. But still, there is, and I get it, a fan base, not just with Chelsea, that want black and white. They want a yes or no. They want a today, is this going to happen? Is it 100%? But very little of what is reported in the transfer market is ever 100% until the very last minute. And it is important to constantly stress that.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a series of just questions for you. We're going to shoot through some things at you. I'm going to ask about football journalism, and then, you know, Matt and Sadiq will ask more on the football side, because we're all Chelsea fans here, full disclosure. If you're watching this channel, you know that already. But, you know, Matt, I used to sell advertising for ESPN, in particular ESPN.com, you know, banner ads, and, you know, getting people to your site to read your stuff and see advertisers that actually pay. So you need unique visitors, you need people to come. So I understand, you know, the process, and, you know, making sure that people go to the website and read the articles, because it's important. It pays for it. But, you know, Thomas Friedman used to talk about, you know, the globalization of, you know, markets, and, you know, the flattening of the earth. And I feel like journalism is in the same boat. There's now this arms race in journalism, to get information out. And, you know, in a 24-hour news cycle, you want to be first. So my first question to you is simple. Now, I'm not going to speak specifically about journalists or news organizations. It wouldn't be fair to you, but I'm just going to speak in generalities. Do you find that being first to a news story has a greater priority than being right about said news story?
Not for me personally, no, the exact opposite. It's far more important to be right than first. And it's also vital that you can shed the full context. So it's very easy to be first if you only go to one side or source. And even if that source or side tells you something you believe to be reliable, if you haven't gone to the other side, you'll never be 100% sure. And ultimately, if we bring it back to Chelsea terms, we saw that in the case of Freund, where Chelsea thought that it was 100%, but had other ideas. And again, I come back to what I said before, that when you are recruiting somebody, whether they're front office, back office, player, superstar, or young player, it is intricate and it can take time. And we also saw this with the takeover as well in the Chelsea case, where everyone connected to the government was actively briefing, and I know it because I was on some of those calls, that there was panic, but government members were also telling me, contrary to the brief, that there was not panic and the sale would get done. So until you piece everything together like a jigsaw, you're not necessarily going to get 100% accuracy. And how many times do we see the crux of a story, even if it's predominantly right, but then later, in retrospect, a key point changes around a transfer fee or a length of contract or a hijack bid that may or may not have happened, all of which is the situation. So yeah, if you are looking at it and your outlet happens to be click-based, or you have a deliverable where you will be rewarded for the number of times that a sponsor ad is seen, or you're just looking to gain personal brand following, then naturally, if you put it out there first, you stand a very good chance of getting a lot of the traction. And that can be a beneficial tactic in a world where people have got low attention spans and they don't care necessarily whether you are right or wrong. But that is a brand discussion, not necessarily an individual journalist discussion, because we pride ourselves on being right and giving context and having credibility. Whereas if you look at a brand, and I said to you, how many times has the Sun got a transfer right in England and how many times has it got one wrong? You wouldn't necessarily be able to give me an accurate answer. But what you is tell me a more accurate or probably more detailed perception of an individual and whether you generally trust that journalist or not. So there's almost more responsibility on our shoulders than the brand to be right. And there's almost more responsibility on the brand to be first. And you have to balance that. And you can balance that in a number of ways, because if you've got an exclusive, you are going to be first and you're going to be confident that you're right as well. So kind of a gray area in the middle when the news is out there for everyone, or when someone catalyzes a story and you have to add to it, react to it. It's developing. Like if we bring it into today and even politics with the British Prime Minister Liz Truss resigning, she's resigned, and that is the news that is out there definitively. But then from there, who is first to the candidate likely to stand, who is first to the approach and the format for how they're going to decide a next prime minister and so on. And this is that grey area where the journalist is trying to get full context and not be concerned with being first, but the outlet is desperate to try and be first because that's what draws in the traction. But one final thing that I'd add is that you can try constantly and do both. You can try and be first and right, and you can pride yourselves on the speed. But unfortunately, if you do that 99 times out of 100 and you happen to pull it off, the one time you fail and you're too quick and you're incorrect, your credibility goes out of the window. And that's why we as journalists, or me personally, I can't speak for colleagues, but I think most people agree with my side and perception. I prefer to take my time. I prefer to piece everything together, and then I prefer to present the situation. And that does mean that you might not be as exclusive, or you may not be seen to be the one that is there immediately. But when you finally present it, you should have all of the facts, which means actually you are being exclusive and you are giving more context and you are giving more information, because you're building upon the story with information that nobody else has necessarily got, because they've decided to put it out there quickly and you've decided to be somebody that digs a bit further. And to give you a specific example of that, Thomas Tuchel's sacking, it came relatively out the blue, and a lot of people are therefore prone to jump on the sacking and the successor. And I was able to piece together the actual narrative, which it turned out had started with that pre-season defeat to Arsenal by 4-0. So then suddenly I'm building a story by talking to all sides that actually tells you the reason behind the sacking, which is, I think, is interesting for a fan base to read so they can work out whether or not it was knee-jerk, what led to it, the different personalities at stake, and so on. And I think this is what I enjoy about journalism. Don't always chase after the immediacy, chase after the framework and context around the story, because I genuinely think that that is of interest to people.
Well, and I really appreciate that answer. And I just appreciate your modus operandi, because I actually do believe that immediacy has supplanted proper vetting. And I'm the type of person that's obsessed with journalism, and I'm obsessed with the process. Now, I'm not a journalist, but I'm obsessed with people like you that get it right and take the time and don't go for the easy reward, because there's a much larger and more profound reward if you actually do it right. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, so Ben, obviously, in terms of now a bit more Chelsea, it's been 6 months into Todd Boehly's ownership of Chelsea, and it's safe to say, as you've found in the summer, it's been quite an eventful one. 8 players coming in, multiple staff, left, right, centre, whether it's board members, physios, leaving, people coming in, still people to recruit, and then particularly Thomas Tuchel being replaced by Graham Potter. My question now, after the honeymoon period is finished effectively with Todd Boehly, what is Boehly's big vision from your point of view in journalism, and from what you've gathered over the next few months of what Chelsea's big vision is for the future?
Well, I think they've not changed in their big vision, and that's because the sale process was so strict and prescriptive that they had to spell out that vision before they even had the club in their hands. And all they're now really trying to do is implement that vision. And on the football side, not much has actually changed in terms of goals. A lot of change of personnel, but they want to qualify for the Champions League, and they want to go as far in the Champions League as they possibly can. And they want to continue the success on field that they had under Roman Abramovich, but they need to do that in a very different way, because the club has to modernize and become more sustainable, because the Abramovich model was not something that could continue, especially not with a new player like Newcastle in the market, who Chelsea's owners know very well, plus the fact that Manchester City have this multi-club model, which has now led to so much success in recent seasons, and Liverpool are also going to be there or thereabouts. So a change, I think, even though it was unexpected in the manner in which Roman Abramovich departed, was necessary for Chelsea on and off the field. And the vision has a variety of different aspects. Number one is a multi-club model that might not be imminent per se, but they are already looking at different clubs, particularly in France and in Portugal and in Brazil. And Glick is the sort of main name leading on that, but with a variety of external input. And the multi-club model is important because it immediately gives us a clue as to what kind of structure Todd Boehly and his team wants at Chelsea. And in very basic terms, that structure is going to have more of an internal connection between all aspects of the club, whether that's the academy through to the first team, whether that's the women's team and the men's team, whether it's the football side or the brand. There will be more connection, and the connection will come through key appointments and also a more efficient use of data, because the ownership group were really quite staggered comparative to their rivals at how little data they inherited, and as damningly how poorly the data was actually used and connected. So we're going to see a data-led approach, we're going to see a multi-club model, and we're going to see a firm emphasis on youth. And when you invest in youth, you really get 2 bites at the cherry. The first one is that you find a player a lot cheaper because they're young. And then if they develop, they end up in your first team and you get a superstar out of them. And if it doesn't work out, then you either give them pathways for a football career within your group, where Chelsea sits at the top of the pyramid and other clubs at different levels get them the regular game time, or you sell them on for more than you ultimately paid for them. And that can help finance bringing in elite level players. So it's a smart model. There's much more finesse to it than I've described, but that is the basics, that you invest in youth, you spot them early before your rivals, you develop them. If you've got a multi-club model, then they have pathways within your group. And Chelsea have always been quite bad at that. They've had loan agreements and informal agreements with other clubs, but they've also just signed a lot of players on the whims of specific managers that have seen their game time limited and their careers semi-ruined. And when the manager changes, they're just ultimately not right for the football club anymore. And I think that Todd Boehly is looking to be smart in recruitment. And the recruitment that we see now isn't necessarily the recruitment of the future, because if you get everything right, you won't keep needing to spend 300 million. And if you do spend 300 million, you can take that liberty on a or a couple of elite level players rather than having to bring in 6 or 7. But let's not forget that what Boehly inherited was a series of outgoings off the back of sanctions, a lot of departures, both with footballers, but also executives. And all of that change, plus the sanctions and the uncertainty before it, led to Chelsea being behind their rivals. So there really was a necessity to spend and hire. But that doesn't mean that they're going to continue like this indefinitely, but it's still a really good sign of ambition. So the vision is this multi-club model. It's data-led, and it's also about learning how to modernize the club, which is why they've done a 100-day or so review in every single aspect. And the modernization will extend to brand growth, not just in football on the men's side, but the women's side. And Todd Boehly's got great experience in esports as well. And these kind of areas can help commercialize the club and grow the brand globally. And then on top of that, there'll be straight commercial opportunities, whether it's stadium naming rights or shirt sponsor deals, that all will be within their wheelhouse to just get better deals. And then if you look at the fan side, they will improve the stadium through renovation, which will also help modernize the football club. And that's really important, because when you upgrade your facilities, whether it's a training facility or a stadium, it also helps draw players to the football club. Because when a top level player like Erling Haaland, when he joined Manchester City, Jude Bellingham will be exactly the same. His sources have already told me this very openly. The modern elite footballer is much more dispassionate than people realize when they make a decision. And that is normal, because if you're Bellingham, let's say at Dortmund, and you've got 5 amazing offers from elite level clubs, and you're pretty confident the money's going to be the same, and you know they're all going to have Champions League football, how do you then make the decision? And it's very easy to just say, well, what do I want? Do I know anybody at the football club who's courted me the most? And these are all factors. But like with Haaland at Man City, and Bellingham will do the same, they often just score a club dispassionately, so then they can work out what the data at their end shows. So who's got the best training facility, who's got the best stadium, who's got the biggest fan base, who's got the manager with the most pedigree. And of course, then there's these other things like who's going to pay me the most, who do I know there, what's the city like, how hard have the club tried to get me, where am I living, what are they going to throw in, is there a sign-on bonus, how long the contract is. But they can put them all down on paper. And that's what Haaland did before choosing to join Manchester City. So yes, his dad had an affinity with the club, and that was probably a column in terms of how he scored it, because there was a sentimental aspect to it. But footballers no longer just make a decision on a whim. They're very methodical and scientific about it. So if you're Chelsea and you can show we've got a group, we've got a structure, we've got a people culture, we've got commercial growth that you can cash in on for your personal brand, we've got football success, we've got a manager with a psychology degree that genuinely cares, we're in a capital city, and we're going to modernize X, Y, and Z. So if you stay with us for 7 years, then you're going to have absolutely everything to be an elite level footballer. Those are the kind of marginal gains that are the difference between getting an elite level footballer and missing out to a rival. And I think this, again, is part of Chelsea's vision. So that's their kind of broad thinking. Naturally, it's all going to take time. And it's a strange period really now, because they've come in and they were quite unknown. And then they did their 100-day review and they changed their manager. So naturally now fans are really only interested in, is it going to stabilise? Can we continue to win games? Are we going to qualify for the Champions League? Who are we buying in January or next summer? And that becomes the focus. So they almost have to firefight the immediacy, because there's been so much turmoil at the club. But at the same time, behind the scenes, strategically, they're thinking about the bigger picture, which I've just outlined.
Oh, Ben, I just want to go watch another game right now. Woo! I am excited. That's great, man. It's such a wonderful answer. Thank you for being so thorough, because we really appreciate it. So I'm going to transition back to a journalism question. Has Twitter weakened the power of the Fourth Estate?
Has it weakened the what, sorry?
The power of the Fourth Estate. Has it weakened the power of traditional media? Has it made it more difficult for traditional outlets to make the same stamp that they used to?
Not necessarily, because the outlets move into that space. So we refer, or we have done over the last few years, to those that come into social spheres. They often get termed as digital disruptors. And that ultimately means that instead of having linear TV showing you your game or .com providing you with your articles, or of course before the digital age, physical newspapers or magazines, you now have a kind of crossover of subscription-based sites, which are not quite the same as the old school traditional .coms, The Athletic being a good example.
Yep.
And then digital disruptors who don't really care as much about linear TV, with Amazon or Apple or DAZN being good examples of that. And as more move into the social sphere or the online sphere, the landscape changes once again, and what you get out of your social media or what you get out of your subscription changes. And at the same time, the more traditional old guard within the media have to adapt. And the BBC is a good example of that. They're very keen all of a sudden on young audiences, of airing rights online on their iPlayer rather than only on BBC One or BBC Two. And this is normal because the industry has shifted. And if it goes to the full extreme, of course, we'll end up seeing two things. One is the Amazons of this world not just taking a Premier League week, but potentially having a subscription for all of the Premier League if they're able to get more games. And that will be interesting because obviously they'll have partners where they can air their output on linear TV. But ultimately, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you've already got all of that. So it seems quite good value for money. And instead of trying to take your money, they will be looking instead for you to maybe be incentivized by shopping during a game. Maybe you get a deal to buy a shirt if your team wins and it's 25% off. So you're like, great, I'm going to take advantage of that because I was thinking about buying merchandise anyway. And in addition, you often have the gamification of sport within these digital disruptors. So if anyone's seen NBA, for example, you often get polls or quizzes coming up and the live sponsorship is read during the actual matches, and the corners MLS are sponsored when you're listening to the output. And this again is the gray area and how things are changing. It's no longer social media and a threat. It's no longer digital and a threat. Digital is becoming the leader, the core through which sports federations and individual clubs and players are seeing the landscape now. And it's actually the older media of .com, of newspapers, of magazines, of linear TV that are having to react and adapt. And then on top of that, which makes it even more complicated, is that it isn't only outlets that are newer and decide to be digital-led in the way that they present sport that are changing the landscape. It's also the fact that the leagues or the clubs can consider going what we call DTC, which stands for direct to consumer.
Yeah.
So you're watching Amazon or DAZN and you're like, great, they're making a lot of money. Everyone likes the output. People are quite prepared to watch it online. Nobody's moaning that the Premier League was all on Amazon because everyone's got a laptop or they're streaming it through their smart TV, or it's going to be streamed anyway using a provider so you can still watch it on a channel on your TV. And then the Premier League might turn around and go, great, thanks for doing all of the hard work, Amazon. We've now decided that we can commercialize this ourselves. So we are going to sell it direct to the consumer instead of selling it to Amazon and letting them sell it to the consumer. And that's another way potentially that the landscape could move. So there's all of these constantly evolving permutations, and they're influenced as well by new platforms. So if you'd have asked me this question 5 to 7 years ago, we wouldn't have necessarily factored in Twitch or TikTok or Snapchat. But now the leagues, clubs and federations like the idea of putting highlights on there, doing watch parties on there, having alternative streams. So for CBS, for example, we've got the NWSL, and we have often aired one output on our linear TV channel on CBS and then had a secondary stream, which is via Twitch, in order to make it a little bit more informal and draw in a new audience. If you look at Qatar 2022, they've signed up a provider to do gamification, which means that the world feed now that you watch the games on will have integration that allows you to input more actively. And in doing so, it holds your attention span, which means that you might be able to see an advert or you might buy something. But either way, you're lingering longer because you're not just being asked to watch passively, you're being asked to do something active, like watch the game and partake in a poll. And this is all, in essence, to put it in the simplest terms, even if it isn't literally in this sense, about having a second screen experience.
Yeah.
I say literally because it might be second screen in the sense you might be watching linear TV and you might be on your phone at the same time. And how can those two interact? But it might also just be two things within one screen, such as watching the World Cup on your laptop and in the top right-hand corner whilst the stream is going on, putting something in a chat or answering a poll or buying something. And again, that's how everything is changing. It's not really about a threat. It's more about an opportunity because the leagues, clubs and federations realize that this is where the money is. And whereas 10 years ago, they may have seen digital or social specifically as just an aside, as a bit of fun, as not important. I think now everybody realizes that in the long term, it's where the money's going to be. So instead of trying to fight it and keep things old school, I think that we're actually going to see it embraced because it's how clubs, leagues and federations make money. And actually, it's going to be more fragmented, in my opinion. So not
Me too.
I
think so too.
Just DAZN, just Amazon, just digital. I actually think what you're going to have is, with newer platforms, a kind of creator rights category as well. So you'll almost have linear TV and then you'll have digital rights for sports presentation and output. And that can be live or it can be non-live, things like highlights and features. And then a third category where perhaps on a Twitch, a creator, a YouTuber, a newer kind of member of the digital sphere might also have the ability somehow, either live or non-live, to officially present the rights in some way. And then when you add things like NFTs and all of the other non-live stuff that can kind of help a brand, a league, a club, a federation grow, that's where the opportunity is. The digital sphere is only going to snowball. And if a league, club or a federation or a journalist ignores that and doesn't embrace it and learn the skill set with how to deal with it, they will quickly fall behind in terms of how they present their output.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example is, my dad used to be one of the GMs at Channel 2 in Utah, and he would negotiate with a sister station of CBS called KMYU to host the Real Salt Lake games, Real Salt Lake being an MLS team. That deal is now expiring for the local broadcast because the MLS as a whole has now signed on a deal with Apple TV for a league-wide streaming service to get all the games. So that's a perfect example of a league recognizing the power of streaming and basically making a conglomerate and a pay-as-you-go for anybody that wants to be a part of it, any fan. Instead of localizing, it's become a national thing. It's pretty crazy. Matt, what do you got?
Yeah, so going back to kind of the Chelsea stuff, obviously we spoke about Boehly's big vision, long-term, or the kind of multi-club level. But obviously, Chelsea fans, you know what they're like. They want the instant news now. Who's coming in? Who's coming out? I've had plenty of messages saying, ask Ben Jacobs about Vardio, ask Ben Jacobs about Nkuku, Leao, whoever. My question obviously is, in the January window, what are the positions that Chelsea, not specifically player, but what positions are Chelsea looking at as a priority to maybe build the squad, looking to improve going into the latter part of the season?
Well, not everything will be done in January, but it's absolutely obvious that midfield is the priority. That's the first thing to say. And I don't think that Chelsea have made any secret of that. They'd have liked to further strengthen midfield if they could have done towards the end of the window with Edson Alvarez. He didn't turn up for training on the final day of the window, but the Ajax board were having none of it. And Todd Boehly, as I understand it, went back to Alvarez and said, we will be coming for you, so keep us on your radar, and vice versa. And that tells you that Zakaria is not a long-term solution. It's very normal, particularly on the final day of the window. And when at the time you had a manager like Thomas Tuchel to move because there was just a necessity for numbers. and depth. But much like Artemelo at Liverpool, Chelsea don't see Zakaria as a long-term solution. It was more just a short-term signing right at the end of the window because they needed a body in that midfield, even though ironically he hasn't played any minutes yet. He still obviously was on the bench last night. He's part of the squad. So midfield is number one in January, and Edson Alvarez will definitely be in the mix. But what's interesting, of course, about midfield, even though Chelsea could easily go for a more attack-minded midfielder and a defensive midfielder, because they have to plan in the long term for life without Jorginho and Kante. It may not be imminent. We know that the club are in talks with Kante regarding a new contract, but they haven't made a great deal of progress. So it's possible, more than possible, in fact, that Kante doesn't renew with Chelsea, which means that when you look at the midfield over the next 1 to 3 windows, let's say, Chelsea could easily need a marquee DM and a marquee AM. And that's why they might look at more than just one name. But it is interesting when you think about midfield. Some of the big names that Chelsea would love won't be available until the summer. So what they won't necessarily want to do in January is spend big out of panic or trying to get their business done quickly instead of planning more long term. And this is what clubs do. They work multiple windows ahead. And fans always want the immediate, but to get a really elite level player, you've got to be 2 or 3 windows ahead. You've got to be on them, on their family, on their agents, develop relationships with the selling club as well. And that's why I say with a player like Jude Bellingham, Liverpool and Real Madrid are ahead of Chelsea. And that's also why the sanctions on Chelsea and the uncertainty at the club have set them back, because it's not always about who you get in a window. It's also about what work you do during a window and across the year in order to lay the foundations. And then when the time is right to move, in you come. So I don't think January, therefore, should be viewed as Chelsea having to find a solution for every single position. They might wait. And then come the summer, they can be in the conversation for a Declan Rice or a Jude Bellingham, at which point the market is right to provoke a sale. But Edson Alvarez is one to watch. And then naturally, Nkunku is another player that Chelsea are very close to signing. A secret medical with Chelsea staff already took place somewhere near Frankfurt, now about 3 weeks ago. The player's very keen on Chelsea. There's an in principle agreement in place between the clubs, but nothing is 100% yet. And that's a key point, because until it is 100%, Nkunku himself has not entered into anything exclusive with Chelsea or legally binding, which means that if another suitor realizes what Chelsea are up to, and it's public knowledge now, they could also try their luck. And players can agree multiple deals with different clubs. As we basically saw with Rafinha, okay, he didn't sign anything with Chelsea, but he agreed in principle to the Chelsea terms on offer and then just left them on ice, waiting for that move to Barcelona. So Chelsea will want to get this wrapped up as quick as possible. And they have 2 options with Nkunku still. One is that it is a summer signing, which is the anticipation at the moment. And if they pay above the release clause, then they can negotiate on their terms. Whereas if they pay the release clause by triggering it, they can't define the structure of the deal, which means they would have to make a lump sum payment up front. And that is not beneficial to the football club. So it's almost ideal for Chelsea to spread the finances and pay a little bit more, but then they've actually got the payments on their terms. And a deal is so often not about the numerical amount, but the structure of the deal. So Chelsea's aim is to get a better structure of the deal for Nkunku and then line it up for next summer. But they do also have a lesser probability chance, if they wish, of trying to get him in January too. And they'd obviously have to pay a lot more. And it's not impossible, but sources close to the club at the moment are still intimating that it is much more likely to be with a view to next summer, because the player wants to see out a full season and doesn't want any kind of distraction of a move building up to the World Cup or after it. So we'll have to wait and see on that one, but it's very close. So he's obviously a name to look out for. And then if we look at other positions, we know that Chelsea want another striker, especially because it remains to be seen whether Aubameyang will stay beyond a season. But even if he does, it's highly, highly unlikely, even under Graham Potter, that Romelu Lukaku will return. Lukaku wants to stay at Inter. and the clubs entered into the first year of loan knowing that they couldn't make it a 2-year loan under the Serie A rules, but there's a gentleman's agreement that they can come back if everything goes according to plan and extend that loan. It effectively would be a fresh loan, but in essence, because of the gentleman's agreement, it's kind of an extension of the loan. And then from there, I think if everything goes according to plan, Inter would be quite happy to sign Lukaku. So Chelsea would like another striker as well. And then naturally, a central defender isn't out of the question either, simply because Thomas Tuchel always wanted one more, and he never ended up getting one more. So even with Koulibaly coming in, and even with Wesley Fofana too, Tuchel still wanted one other. Maybe a straight centre-back, maybe a more versatile centre-back that could also play on the right-hand side as well. And now with Reece James injured, even though he'll be back after the World Cup, so the break kind of does Chelsea a favour, and with Fofana injured as well, I still think a defensive reinforcement could easily be on the cards too. So Vardiol is still a little bit problematic simply because there's more work to be done comparative to Nkunku, and Chelsea have obviously been working on that since the back end of the last window to see what might be possible. But generally, if we take the names out of the equation, I think 3 would be the maximum in terms of senior level players, because they want to be quite youth focused that they might look to bring in. And even 3 could end up being a push, but clearly a defender, clearly a midfielder, and clearly a striker are still on the radar. And then specifically the defender might be more versatile, that can play fullback, centre-back, or might be a straight centre-back. The midfielder, depending on what happens with Zakaria, could be a DM to begin with, and then they would leave the space in the summer to explore somebody like a Jude Bellingham. But obviously the cards potentially for Declan Rice as well, who is a defensive midfielder. So then what do you do in January? And these are the questions that Todd Boehly and his new recruitment team need to discuss. So that's a key point, as I said before, that they don't want to just move for the sake of it in January if they've got longer term targets that they think are right for the club that they can then get in the summer. And again, the same applies for the striker as well. First, they need to decide if it's more a creative-minded player that's versatile. So going for Rafinha tells you that that's one position, not really a striker, more just a forward line player that can contribute with goals or assists. And then when you look at Aubameyang, more of the old-fashioned striker. So which one of those 2 does Graham Potter think is necessary? Because he won't get both. And then the other thing I would just add is that how many he gets and whether it is that position type A or that position type B will be more based upon the outgoings, because if we get to the World Cup and then after it and Pulisic shines and someone comes in for him on a permanent deal, Ziyech could still get a move to a club like AC Milan, then you have the outgoings to create the space on the wage bill and within the squad to be a bit more active in the market. So I'm not expecting a crazy January. I'm not expecting some £300 million January, and I'm not expecting a massive wave of signings. But what I would say is that as soon as the window is closed, Chelsea are trying to line things up. They're trying to avoid a panic. They're trying to avoid chaos. There's much more structure upcoming to the next 2 windows, and I would imagine that's quite reassuring to fans.
Yeah, I mean, and I do want Chelsea to be cognizant of the profound disparity between need and want. If you look at just yesterday, Carney, Chukwuemeka, and Armando Broja, those are revelations. And if you give them even more time, you will start to see how truly profound these players will eventually become. I am very high on both of them. So it's like, okay, yeah, we do want maybe certain things to be addressed like a defensive midfielder. But those 2 players, I mean, those I do believe are players that will stay and will thrive under Chelsea. My next and probably final journalistic question for you is pretty simple. What do you find in your line of work that football fans get most wrong, most often? Like,
Well, I think that fans know their club, and that's brilliant. And as journalists, we should always respect that, because it's an insight that we don't have. And I would never pretend to know Chelsea better than a fan. I would never pretend to be aware of the history and the heritage, because I've not got a stake in the game. I've not been watching the club as a fan for the last however many decades. But in being that fan, the perspective is blinkered. And like I said before, as journalists, we go to multiple sources, whereas a fan is quite prepared to accept and believe a singular source, especially if it comes from their club. So when we as journalists report something, if the situation changes, we're frauds. But if your manager says something on record and the situation changes, he or she is not a fraud. And that tells you that the fan base is quite prepared to swallow whatever the club tell them as fact. But a journalist is not ultimately given that same kind of liberty. And I think, therefore, when we as journalists bring good news in keeping with that club perspective as to what a fan wants, we're kind of heroic. And when we bring bad news, there's a question mark as to whether we are credible and the bad news is right. And that's kind of classic fan denial at times. But in fairness, it's also because there's a lot of clickbait journalism out there that does prove to be incorrect. So I totally understand and respect why fans are cautious. And at times they want to wait for official news. But this is the paradox, that I can put something out there and simultaneously get 50 messages telling me, why are you covering this? That's not a significant update. News. Then I can type something not Chelsea and it can be flooded with 50 comments going, tell us Nkunku news, tell us Nkunku news. And you think, well, the last time I told you Nkunku news, 50 of you told me, why are you telling us Nkunku news? And that is kind of the most frustrating thing.
Ben, I read it. Barcelona news only, Ben. Barcelona news only, right?
No, I mean, I just told a couple of people that you were coming on, and if they wanted any questions, and the amount of DMs I've got of certain targets this, certain targets that, I can understand exactly where you're coming from in terms of that.
Of course.
I think, honestly, what a fan gets wrong the most, there's no acceptance of the process of how a transfer works. And I don't blame fans for this, by the way, because it's complicated. But if you have a basic transfer, first of all, the fee will always be disputed because the transfer fee is PR and it is undisclosed because the buyer and the seller want a different narrative. So if you look at Fofana, Leicester will be quite happy to say it's a world record fee because it positions them in the market as a club that always gets the highest rate. And then Chelsea will want to make it clear it's not a world record fee because they don't want to be seen as the club that always pays above the odds. And that was what was quite interesting about Marc Cucurella, because the fee paid, we believe from sources, and luckily in this case, Brighton and Chelsea are a bit more on the same page. 62 million all in could be the potential fee. That's miles above the valuation in the market. And when I talk to other senior executives at clubs that were interested in the player, they all say 35 to 40 million was the valuation. So then Chelsea, therefore, have paid over 20 million above the odds. And they obviously believe in doing so. It's a smart piece of business. But imagine the next bit of business you do. You're suddenly the club that goes up and up and up and up in what you pay. And when you add some of the failed targets that were also very high in their bidding, like Rafinha, Chelsea suddenly become the club that are quite prepared to throw cash around. And this, by the way, is a reason why Newcastle have not played ball with agents, have not caved in, have walked away from targets like Hugo Ekitike, who ended up at PSG, because they don't want to set the tone as the club with money that will just spend their money carelessly. Chelsea had a bit more necessity to bring people in, so they were in a weaker position in the market. But fans don't always understand that a transfer fee, unless it is disclosed, and very rarely is it, is not definitive. It's PR to paint yourself in the market. Then when you are linked with a player, that can be tactical. And not only can it be tactical, but if you're looking at that player, it might not be for this window because you may realize that they're unattainable. And the other thing is that when you look for an individual player, you will yardstick them against other players within the industry. So if Chelsea are linked with two players, it might not be because they want both players. It might be because they are putting out there in the market two players. So then if they are like for like, when they go back to the player they want, they've got a rival player in the mix, and it can help you when you negotiate because you can go to the club and say, wait a minute, you want 50 million for this player, but as you well know, we're looking at other players. And then the selling club see the news and they're like, yikes, they're looking at a like-for-like player, a like-for-like age, but he's only 35 million. So then we might reduce the price because deep down we want the sale. And I think a good example of that is a smaller club comparative to Chelsea. So everyone knows about Mudryk at the moment at Shakhtar, and the interest is more from Arsenal than Chelsea at this stage. But Shakhtar, because of their situation, will eventually sell Mudryk, and they're saying they want 50 million euros, and that's normal. And his price is only going to rise because he's doing really well in the Champions League. But if Arsenal end up having a comparative target that's like for like in that position, and that target is only 35 million, and Shakhtar think, we might end up losing out here, and then Mudryk says, don't sell me out of my dream move to Arsenal, please, let's compromise and do it for 40, then suddenly Arsenal have leveraged effectively a bit of fake news or a yardstick player, and they've intentionally put that out there to kind of use as part of the negotiation tactic. And clubs do that, and agents do that, and obviously selling clubs do it the other way around. They will take a club that is, in inverted commas, interested, and they might sometimes feed the media, because then again, the club they actually want to sell with may feel pressured to up their offer. And the caveat to that is it's not all played out through the media, because the intel amongst clubs is incredible. So if you want to know what Chelsea are doing, one of the best sources as a journalist in terms of digging can actually be to also ask your sources at other clubs, because sporting directors will be well aware what other sporting directors are doing, in the same way that businesses are very aware of what other businesses are doing. It's kind of market research. And therefore, when I ask different people about different clubs, I often get the information through a wide variety of sources. But I come back to what I said before, that you have to go to multiple sources, because if you don't, then you might only get the PR angle, you might only get the briefing angle. So I think fans don't always understand the dynamic of a transfer. They don't always understand where the links come from. They don't always understand the market can change minute on minute, second on second, let alone every day or week. They don't always understand how a fee works, and they don't always understand that the number is not always that important compared to the structure. And that was very key with the Wesley Fofana deal. And I don't mean that critically, because even I don't understand half the time how the industry changes and what goes on behind closed secret negotiations, but it's never as clear cut as you think. And it's funny how when you hear your club tries to hijack, you're quite pleased and you're like, oh, that sounds good. So Chelsea tried to hijack Zeus. They tried to hijack Richarlison as well. But imagine it from a journalist point of view. So there you are, you followed the whole story, and you get to the transfer and you're told it's done. And the buyer tells you it's done, and the seller tells you it's done, and the price gets given to you, etc., etc., etc. And you publish it. And then 3 hours after you've published, a totally random club sneak up and make a better offer, and the whole landscape changes and the player's head has turned. And you can't undo what you've published, but you were not wrong either at the time of publication. And this happens more often than you think. It's just if a hijack is successful, it will be denied by the buyer and the seller. Even if a bid is made and it's rejected, it will often be denied by the buyer and the seller. That's just normal protocol. So this is why the market is always so confusing. And again, it's why I give these long answers. It's why I write these long threads. Context is key.
But to be honest, I find you very unique that you do these long threads and you do explain the knowledge rather than just give us the information. That's why I kind of look towards you more than other journalists, because you give us the extra information to make us understand.
You know, Matt, I mean, look at it this way, because this is a perfect example. Yesterday, this happened in the NBA, and this is why everybody needs to pay attention to, if the number is bigger, whether it's the transfer or the salary, you have to understand and ask yourself, who benefits the most for the larger number, right? And it's oftentimes the selling club and the agent of the player. So if you look at Jordan Poole's new deal for the Golden State Warriors, some say it was $140 million over 4 years. Some say it was $123 million over 4 years. And the journalist that said it was $140 million is repped by the same agency that reps Jordan Poole. So you always have to look at the larger number and say, who benefits from the larger number? Because oftentimes it's actually a smaller number plus add-ons, plus bonuses, plus caveats that may never even be reached. But look who benefits and who doesn't. Go ahead, Matt. You got another last question?
I'll kind of ask it and then I have to go because I've got to go back to work.
No worries, buddy.
But final question for me is about Carney Chukwuemeka. Obviously, when Tuchel was in charge, he kind of suggested in a press conference that Chukwuemeka would be integrated into the squad very slowly over this season and into the future. Now, obviously, Tuchel is gone, Potter is here, and Carney's made a couple of substitution appearances. Last night's Brentford performance was a bit of a nice performance for the fans. I think he got a lot of praise from certain people. So, Ben, from your point of view and from what you've seen from sources within Chelsea, what is Carney's future under Potter? Is it same as what Tuchel was saying, or do you think he'll have a bit more of a role under Potter?
Well, I think that Graham Potter's had one-on-ones with all players and everybody's got a clean slate. Chelsea didn't buy Chukwuemeka to just leave him lingering in the under-23s and playing a handful of games. And if that becomes the plan, then they will absolutely have to send him out on loan somewhere for his development. Otherwise, it becomes the type of transfer that stagnates his career. And let's not forget, this is not a player that's just broken onto the scene. This is a player that in 2021, 2022, played 13 times for Aston Villa, 11 of those in the Premier League. So involved in almost 1 in 3 Premier League games. So then if you come to Chelsea and you're not getting the game time, very frustrating. And at 15 million plus 5 million in highly attainable add-ons, that's a massive investment. And like I said before, other clubs very much across that transfer and that fee, and they see it as very high. And that tells you that Chelsea have moved fast and very sensitively on this transfer to blow their rivals out of the water, because they believe, okay, maybe it is 5 million more than he's worth, but if he becomes the player we think he's capable of, he will be a 50 million, a 75 million pound player. And then suddenly, who cares about that 15 million plus 5? And that's the line of thinking. So I think with Thomas Tuchel, he was very much about, I've not got time, given the outgoings and given the pressure and given the uncertainty, to just chuck a 19-year-old who only turned 19 today, by the way, so 18 at the time, into the... And that was one of the problems, again, that disconnect between ownership and the manager. And I don't want to come across as only critical of Tuchel, because there's two sides to every story, but Tuchel's perspective was very much great, put an emphasis on youth, but build the model first. And once you've built the model, then we'll develop the pathways and everyone will get a chance. And if we have to loan players out and if we have to wait a little bit, then that's fine, because ultimately these are young players that you've got time to be patient with. But Tuchel's priority was ultimately to fix the defence and to continue winning games. And he was very frustrated because he felt in many ways that the players he wanted to do that were not there, but also that he was being micromanaged into certain signings and doing things in certain ways. And of course, the ownership group will argue the opposite, that Tuchel was just trying to continue a system, even though he'd won trophies, that was not sustainable and didn't work. And they, as an ownership group, were trying to bring in blood and give them game time. And if you don't have the model in place, and if you're not going to loan out the player, then someone like Chukwuemeka has to be factored into the first team. And I think that Graham Potter is not that different to Thomas Tuchel in terms of how he likes to actually manage a football team. More of a man manager, much more so than Tuchel. But I mean in the sense that he's using Macaulay to have the conversations on the football side, and he wants to be the guy on the training field calling all the shots and not overly interfered with. But he's much more of a people person than Tuchel. But Tuchel was the same. He wants to be the guy on the football field calling the football shots. But the difference is that Graham Potter is quite prepared to bring young talent through and give them cameos and opportunities. And we saw that not just with the young players, but with Potter's rotation. Whereas I think Tuchel felt like the squad's too thin, I don't have enough quality, I've got absolutely no time to just chuck in at the time an 18-year-old. And that's the key point of difference. So the stability, the turn in results, and almost the enforced nature of a congested fixture calendar mean that Graham Potter gets to look at these fixtures very differently, because first of all, Chelsea are undefeated under Potter. It's not like they've just lost in Zagreb. Imagine if you'd lost in Zagreb and then you went away at Brentford immediately afterwards and you suddenly rested 8 players. I'm just making up a number here. And Chukwuemeka came in. fans would say, yikes, we're in big trouble here. What are we playing at? We desperately need a result. But it's much easier after you've got back-to-back wins after Milan. You've got some hard-fought victories in the Premier League. Then you can say, okay, everyone accepts that Manchester United is a massive game. Midweek, we're away at Brentford. I'm going to chop and change and let's see what the young talent can do, not just Chukwuemeka, but Broja as well. So I think it's too early to say Potter's going to be different to Tuchel, but it's early enough to say that Potter is going to manage youth personally. And we know from his time at Villa, so we're not only talking about Chelsea, that Chukwuemeka is very capable playing at Premier League level. He's fast, he's powerful, he's direct, he's hungry. There's a little bit of finesse needed. There's a little bit of development in terms of getting that head up. And there's understanding the tactical nuances of the game, particularly around game management, because it can be tricky when you're a teenager and you get thrown on. You're all energy, you want to make an impression. But that's very different if you start starting games and there's a set role, there's a set system as Chelsea look to boss the game. And he's surrounded by a lot more quality, with all due respect, than he was at Aston Villa. And that will make a difference as well, because other players are going to be creating space for him and vice versa. And that will affect the way that he plays, and it will allow him to have a bit more time potentially on the ball. And maybe even the people like it, much like with Adama Traore, by the way, as well at Wolves, when players are just direct, when they're physical. But sometimes you don't want just a fast-moving train. Sometimes you want a more cultured footballer that can be unselfish and knows what's around them. And these are the areas of his game that he's going to, I think, learn over time. And Potter sees that and the talent that he has day on day in training. So what I think we're going to see is just, like last night, some game time, some cameos. It's to his advantage that we have a congested fixture calendar, and then let's see what happens. But naturally, if things are going well for Chelsea towards the back end of the season, and if the fixture calendar becomes less congested, then Potter's 11, or most of it, will start picking themselves. And then at that point, Chelsea will have to prioritise big games and short-term over long-term, whereas earlier in the season, and because of a World Cup and because of some injuries, it's a bit different at this point. So Chukwuemeka is still going to have to be patient. Everyone knows he's a phenomenal talent, and now he's trying to live up to this price tag. And let's see. But make no mistake, regardless of whether he plays or not, Chelsea are investing in Chukwuemeka for the long term, which means that they will find him pathways, whether at Chelsea or outside of Chelsea, to make sure that by the time he's, I would say, 21, so in 2 seasons' time, he is a regular fixture for 7 or 8 seasons at Chelsea Football Club.
Yep. Well said. Matt had to go, of course. I know Ben and Carlito have to go, so I'm going to let you guys go for sure. I want to thank Ben for coming on. It's a pleasure for the first time on this channel. Hopefully another time soon again. And we hope to see you soon, Ben Jacobs.
Look forward to it. Always a pleasure, guys. Keep up the good work and best of luck against Manchester United.
Thank you. Take care of yourself.
Bye.
Carlito, pleasure. Thank you for sorting this out for the channel as well. Mr. Carlito, doing things very fast, very efficient, like Todd Boehly. I don't even know if Carlito is still there, or has he left me? Yeah, it sounds like he's left me as well, people. But look, without Carlito, this collab wouldn't be happening, people. I heard a little audio there, Carlito. Are you back? Nah, he's not back. Unfortunately, his audio is gone.
I'm here. Hey,
Carlito, thanks for coming on. Thanks for making it happen today. And I'm sure we'll be talking very soon again. I'll let you go, man. Take care. Guys, everyone, run up the likes as well. Keep liking the video, keep subscribing. If you want more collabs and all that, let us know in the comments down below who else you want to see come on. But yeah, Ben Jacobs on for the first time today, which was quite nice. And obviously the super chat as well. So enough, thank you very much. We got myself on the panel. We are now becoming more of a commercial chain of clubs with Todd Boehly's vision, news of stadium expansion, and also on the cards. Yes, I was at the Battersea Power Station yesterday. They made a new shopping centre. Very, very nice. I felt Chelsea should have basically gone there. I know the bid was there. It was rejected. But surely something could have happened in the works for long term. But it is what it is. But guys, thank you for joining. Keep liking the video. Keep subscribing. I've got to end the stream on my mobile because on my laptop, it just doesn't work for some reason. But yeah, if you want to see anyone else on the streams very soon, any collabs, let us know in the comments down below, people. Until then, I can end it here, man. Peace.